Hey guys, tonight we journey through a time when your breakfast menu, your love life, and the fate of your crops were all blamed on Jupiter's mood swings and the unfortunate alignment of Mercury. We're talking about astrologers, those ancient sky gazers who somehow got everyone from peasants to emperors to believe that distant burning rocks were micromanaging our every move. You're waking up in a time when astrology isn't just a fun internet quiz, it's the literal operating system of your village. Before you open your eyes, someone's already whispering that Venus is in a difficult house, which, according to the town astrologer, means you should absolutely not leave the house today. You peek outside anyway. It's foggy. There's a goat blocking your door, and breakfast smells suspiciously like disappointment. Seems like Venus knew what she was talking about. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle across the straw-covered floor, eyes still adjusting, when someone bursts in yelling, "Don't eat eggs today. Mercury is waning." You blink at them. Who is Mercury? And why does he hate omelets? You were really looking forward to those boiled eggs. But no, the stars say no yolk for you. Instead, you get porridge. Again, watery, gray, and depressing porridge, which apparently aligns better with your rising sign. You see, back then, everything, and I mean everything, was dictated by what astrologers saw in the sky. These weren't hobbyists reading horoscopes for fun. They were professional consultants, part scientists, part wizard, part therapist, and part-time scapegoat. They carried big scrolls, wore serious robes, and stared into the heavens like they were waiting for Sirius to wink. If Mars appeared too close to Saturn, cancel your wedding. If Venus disappeared, stop kissing people immediately. And if Jupiter was too strong, avoid leafy greens and your cousin Phil. Nobody trusted Phil anyway. Historians still argue whether ancient astrologers truly believed their own cosmic logic, or whether they just enjoyed the job security of telling nobles what they wanted to hear. But either way, their influence was real, and sometimes dangerously so. Take, for example, the Babylonians. They didn't just check the stars for fun, they believed eclipses could predict a king's death. In fact, when a bad omen showed up in the sky, they temporarily replaced the king with a peasant substitute king, just in case the cosmos had scheduled a royal smiting. That poor peasant, not exactly thrilled, but hey, at least he got to wear a fancy hat for 2 weeks before mysteriously vanishing. And while all this might sound like distant superstition, remember, people used to make important decisions based on planetary alignments. Should you start a war? Consult the stars. Open a bakery. Ask the moon. Break up with your emotionally unavailable boyfriend who hoards amphorae. Mercury in retrograde says yes. The strangest part is how specific these beliefs got. There were star charts to determine your ideal breakfast foods. Seriously, some medieval European almanacs warned against eating certain grains or fruits if the moon was in a watery sign, which is astrologer speak for no apples if Pisces is sulking. Of course, the average person didn't own a telescope or understand celestial mechanics, but that didn't stop them from obeying the local stargazer, like he was channeling divine truth from a disco ball in the sky. Farmers delayed planting, traders postponed voyages, and once An entire town in 14th century Italy refused to light candles for a week because a shadowy Jupiter meant open flames would anger the spirits. Historians still debate whether the astrologer truly saw a threat or just hated how wax smoke made his robe smell. The irony, most of these astrologers did their best work half asleep. They stayed up all night squinting at stars, scribbling notes, and occasionally mistaking fireflies for omens. They'd emerge in the morning, bleary eyed, over caffeinated by medieval standards, and absolutely confident that a comet spotted near Orion meant your neighbor's goat was probably possessed. And yet, despite the absurdity, it kind of worked. Not the star stuff, obviously, but the confidence. People needed certainty. When your crops could fail, your house could flood, and your neighbors could suddenly accuse you of witchcraft because your bread rose weirdly, astrology gave you rules, structure, an explanation. Even if that explanation was, Mars is throwing a tantrum again. So you sigh, you spoon your sad porridge, and you whisper a quiet thank you to the stars for sparing you from goat possession today. Maybe tomorrow you'll get to eat eggs, or maybe Mercury will still be moody. Either way, you've got your astrologer, and that's both comforting and vaguely terrifying. You're standing in a smoky room now, lit only by oil lamps and the occasional flicker of divine disapproval. A man with suspiciously pointy shoes is unfolding an enormous scroll. He squints, strokes his beard like it owes him money, and announces, "Born under the third moon of Tishrei? Terrible. Absolutely terrible. You'll never become a blacksmith, or marry, or digest lentils." And just like that, your future is toast. Welcome to the curious world of astrological birth charts, where your destiny is pre installed like bloatware you can't delete. You didn't get to choose your career, your temperament, or your likelihood of being struck by lightning on a Tuesday. The stars did that for you while you were still a screaming, swaddled burrito of a human. In Babylon, Egypt, India, and later Rome, astrologers kept detailed horoscopes that dictated social potential based on planetary alignment at the time of birth. And by detailed, I mean frighteningly specific. Were you born during a waning moon with Saturn in the 12th house? That's astrologer speak for congratulations. You will develop gout and an unshakable fondness for pickled fish. Astrological manuals were full of warnings like, beware of children born when Mars is ascendant. They will be quarrelsome and possibly combust spontaneously. Okay, maybe not the combustion part, but definitely the quarrelsome part. Historians still argue whether these predictions were taken literally by everyone or were more of a cosmic hobby for the elite. But we know this. Emperors had birth charts. Pharaohs had star priests. And somewhere, a weary mother was told her newborn daughter was destined to become a midwife who would be suspiciously good at finding lost chickens. You, unfortunately, were born during a Venus-Mars opposition, which basically labels you as emotionally turbulent, prone to naps at inopportune times, and unlikely to keep houseplants alive. Employers took that sort of thing seriously. If you applied to be a scribe and your chart said low mercury influence, you were more likely to get assigned to goat herding, with goats who also had difficult star signs. Astrology in hiring decisions wasn't just superstition, it was policy. Medieval noble households employed astrologers to vet new cooks, guards, and even falcon trainers. If your chart conflicted with the head butler's Jupiter placement, you might be escorted out before your first bread roll hit the oven. Of course, there were remedies, lucky talismans, timing rituals, or changing your name to something more compatible with Saturn. Sometimes people even change the recorded date of their birth to fudge a more promising horoscope. Nothing like a little celestial fraud to boost your career. There's a recorded case from ninth century Baghdad where a merchant faked his horoscope to convince clients he was born under a gold star Jupiter configuration, which apparently implied he was very trustworthy and immune to debt. He wasn't. He fled town 3 weeks later with 5 goats and a very angry loan collector. And let's not forget the romantic implications. If you were born under an unlucky moon, matchmaking became a nightmare. Prospective partners would quietly consult an astrologer and come back with cryptic rejections like, "It's not you, it's your Saturn trine." Translation: they think your vibes are off, and you're probably cursed. The more elite your family, the more scrutinized your star chart became. In Renaissance Italy, noble births were practically followed by an astrological audit. Entire treaties were written about the implications of a newborn prince having Leo as his rising sign. It suggested strength, leadership, and possibly a very dramatic hairline. But even commoners bought into the birth chart business. Wandering astrologers offered quick readings at fairs and festivals, scribbling forecasts with charcoal and a side of existential dread. For a small coin, you could learn that your firstborn would be a carpenter, your second would hate figs, and your third might be a duck. The stars were never entirely clear. Was any of it true? Probably not. But here's the thing: it felt true. When life is unpredictable and full of goats that kick, astrology is weirdly comforting. If Saturn says you're bad with money, well, at least it's not your fault. You impulse bought 3 cloaks and a cursed goblet. Blame the cosmos. And some astrologers did hit the mark. Once, a Roman astrologer predicted that a senator's son would become a powerful general. And he did, which the astrologer never let anyone forget. He charged triple for readings and made everyone wait in line behind a statue of himself pointing at a star. Still, the flip side was less glamorous. If your chart said you were doomed, people avoided you. One poor woman in 16th century Prague was said to have an unfortunate Neptune rising, and she spent most of her adult life being quietly excluded from town feasts, just in case she brought famine with her. In short, birth charts weren't just cosmic curiosities. They were social passports, or red flags. You could rise or fall based on a few squiggles on a wax tablet, written by a man who hadn't slept in 2 days and thought Jupiter was flirting with the moon again. So the next time you read a horoscope that says, "Today's a great day to try something new," just remember, 500 years ago, it could have meant, "Today's a great day to be publicly rejected from goat herding school." And your breakfast still would have been porridge. You're walking along a dirt road when a chicken crosses your path, and immediately someone gasps. "Mars is in opposition," they whisper. That chicken is a warning. You pause, blink, and wonder if it's the chicken that's cursed, or just your week. You see, in the minds of many ancient and medieval folks, Mars wasn't just a planet, he was a menace, a cosmic instigator with a taste for blood, stubbed toes, and inconvenient weather. The moment Mars showed up somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, astrologers grabbed their quills, nobles grabbed their purses, and peasants grabbed whatever superstitious charm was closest. Trouble was coming, and probably in the form of spoiled cabbage. It didn't matter if you were royalty or someone who just sold turnips in a muddy stall. If Mars was being difficult, astrologers warned you not to make any big decisions. No weddings, no treaties, no spontaneous jousting tournaments. however tempting they might be. In fact, there's a well documented episode from 12th century France where a small village postponed all civic meetings for 2 weeks because Mars was conjunct Saturn. According to their astrologer, this meant fiery discord and unfortunate cooking accidents. Tragically, he was right about the cooking part. A local baker dropped an entire tray of dough into the town well. Historians still argue whether this was divine interference or just Butterfingers. Now, astrologers loved Mars because he was such a reliable scapegoat. Got a headache? Mars. Cows stopped giving milk? Mars. Broke a sandal on the way to market and cried in public? Mars again. Honestly, the planet had a busier reputation than most local officials. There's even a 15th century German text that blames Mars for someone's particularly bad haircut. It goes on to suggest avoiding barbers entirely during Mars's retrograde, which is either excellent cosmic wisdom or a very passive aggressive way to fire your stylist. But astrology wasn't all just guesswork and panic. Some of it followed carefully crafted logic. Mars, the red planet, was associated with war, blood, iron, and conflict. So when it glowed especially bright in the night sky, thanks to its orbital position, it looked angry. And angry skies made for anxious astrologers. In Babylon, priests would track Mars' movements on clay tablets, noting any strange behavior. A bright Mars near the moon? Bad news. Mars stationary for too long? Hide your goats. Ancient Chinese records also link Mars with military rebellion. If it lingered near certain constellations, it supposedly predicted palace coups, battlefield losses, or disgruntled eunuchs. You're beginning to see how the daily news sounded a lot like local goat escapes pen. Astrologer blames Mars. To be fair, sometimes it was Mars. Goats are unpredictable, but here's where things get juicier. Kings and generals didn't just fear Mars, they also tried to use him. A bold military leader might launch a campaign specifically because Mars was in a favorable trine. Translation: the stars said it was a good time to yell and wave swords. One Roman emperor, possibly Severus, delayed an entire battle for 2 days so his astrologer could wait for Mars to shift into position. The emperor's army was starving, the enemy was gaining ground, and meanwhile, the sky watchers were squinting at clouds like the fate of the empire depended on a twinkle. It kind of did. They won, but only barely. Mars got the credit. The cook got none. It wasn't always military stuff either. Midwives were told to avoid births during Mars hours. Blacksmiths were warned not to forge during certain planetary alignments. Even politicians timed speeches to avoid Mars glare, which sounds like a laser beam, but was really just a metaphor for public backlash or indigestion. It's hard to tell with astrologers. And remember, Mars didn't just mess with humans, animals got roped in too. If your rooster started crowing at odd hours, some believed it was Mars stirring the natural world into chaos. Cows refused to be milked? Mars. Horses started eating laundry off the line? Yep, Mars again. Either that, or your horse was just passive aggressively protesting your taste in tunics. Of course, the astrologers themselves weren't immune. If a prediction went wrong during a Mars-heavy month, they could be accused of bad omens, or worse, treason. There's a case from the early 1300s where an astrologer in Spain blamed a failed harvest on Mars. The local lord, unimpressed, threw him in a wheat silo to reflect. He came out 2 days later, covered in flour and fully convinced that Mars was haunting him personally. So yes, Mars was the cosmic fall guy, a planetary punching bag for all that went wrong. But he was also respected, feared even, because if you played your cards right, he might lend his fiery energy to your cause. Just don't ask him for relationship advice. That's Venus's job, and we'll get to her drama later. For now, try to walk carefully. The stars say today's not great for stubbed toes, and Mars is watching. You've somehow landed a job in a Renaissance court, which sounds glamorous until you realize your official title is Assistant to the Assistant Court Astrologer, and your main duty involves polishing celestial spheres and nodding meaningfully whenever someone mentions Saturn's malcontented influence. The head astrologer, let's call him Lorenzo, wears 4 rings, 2 velvet robes, and a permanent look of vague cosmic concern. Every morning, he dramatically unrolls a star chart the size of a picnic blanket and mutters things like, "Ah, yes, Saturn opposes Venus in the third house. That explains the Duke's back pain." And the strangest part? The Duke listens wholeheartedly, because during the Renaissance, astrology didn't fade into obscurity, it got fancier. Wealthy patrons paid handsomely for personalized horoscopes, planetary readings, and urgent warnings about lunar discomfort. Kings consulted astrologers before wars. Popes hired them quietly. And Lorenzo? He had power, not just because he read the stars, but because everyone believed he could. One of the quirkiest beliefs of the time was that certain planets caused specific medical conditions. Saturn, in particular, got a bad rap. Too much Saturn in your chart? Expect melancholy, joint pain, and a mysterious longing for soup. The phrase Saturnine temperament literally came from the belief that Saturn made you gloomy and prone to quoting poetry at inopportune times. In fact, there's a record from 1543 of a French nobleman canceling his own wedding because his astrologer said Saturn was dripping bile across the marital sphere. Historians still argue whether that was a real celestial event or just a very fancy excuse to get out of marrying someone named Brunhilde. One documented Renaissance trend involved medical astrologers calculating when a person should undergo bloodletting based on planetary charts. That's right, they wouldn't just stick leeches on you any old time. No. They waited until the moon was in Aries, Mars was ascendant, and your spleen chakra was feeling cooperative, or something like that. You wake up with a sore throat, and instead of tea, your physician consults a zodiac wheel and says, "Let's wait until Jupiter exits Virgo. Your lymph nodes will thank us." Meanwhile, you're wondering if you're about to die of astrology-induced procrastination. It didn't stop at medicine. Entire state decisions hinged on planetary advice. Queen Elizabeth I of England was known to consult her court astrologer, John Dee, before making major political moves. Dee was equal parts mathematician, magician, and part-time mirror collector. He once claimed he could speak to angels through a black obsidian mirror, which, to be fair, is still more reliable than some modern Wi-Fi routers. Lorenzo, your boss, might not talk to angels, but he does predict the outcome of wars, royal marriages, and the likelihood of the Duchess's prized greyhound getting indigestion before her garden party. He's basically a medieval Google Calendar with more velvet and fewer notifications. And somehow, it all seems to work. The Duke avoids a major scandal by delaying a speech until after Mercury's retrograde. The court avoids a food shortage because Lorenzo warned that Mars was eyeing the wheat. Even when the predictions were vague, they gave people a sense of control, like the universe wasn't completely random, just mostly. Still, the line between belief and manipulation was a little wobbly. More than one astrologer was caught adjusting charts to flatter their employer. A famous case in Prague tells of an astrologer who discovered that the emperor's least favorite cousin was born under an unfortunate alignment, thus justifying his exile. Convenient, right? Historians debate whether these astrologers truly believed what they preached or if they were just clever survivalists. After all, a wrong prediction could mean dismissal or imprisonment or being thrown into a moat with bad energy. To be fair, astrology wasn't always about control, it was also used for drama. A Spanish duke once broke off an alliance because a neighboring ruler's horoscope revealed an aggressive Mars and weak Neptune, which apparently translated to rude and emotionally unavailable. Sounds like a royal dating app gone wrong. In private, astrologers were often exhausted, staying up all night tracking stars, dealing with paranoid nobles, and faking confidence when Uranus went missing from the chart. It was a lot. They were overworked, underpaid, and constantly one bad eclipse away from unemployment. But the public never saw that. They saw robes, charts, and confident pronouncements like, "The king's gout shall improve by the waxing crescent." And when the gout didn't improve, well, Mars must have interfered. Again, it was a win win profession, really. If something went well, you were a genius. If it went wrong, blame the sky. Still, you can't help but feel a little sympathy for Lorenzo. He's been predicting Saturn related sadness for 3 weeks straight, and now the royal gardeners have stopped planting anything taller than a cabbage. Saturn hates ambitious vegetables, they explain solemnly. You pour him some watered down wine and gently suggest he lie down. But Neptune's in a crisis spiral, he mumbles. I must stay alert. He then falls asleep in a pile of parchment and snoring scrolls. The stars twinkle outside, blissfully unaware that someone just canceled a diplomatic mission because Mercury seemed passive aggressive. And you? You roll your eyes, tuck the charts back into their chest, and mutter, Mars, take the wheel. You wake up to the sound of bells clanging in panic. Not the usual, someone dropped a chamber pot alarm, but something deeper. Stranger. People are shouting. Dogs are howling. And somewhere a monk is trying to eat a scroll. You peer out your crooked window and see the cause. The moon has gone dark. Now, you and I know it's a lunar eclipse, a perfectly natural, astronomically explainable event. But in the year 1272, or thereabouts, this is not just bad lighting. It's the universe throwing a temper tantrum. It's divine fury, cosmic warning, or possibly a sign that Gregory the Candlemaker's fermented cabbage finally offended the heavens. Eclipses, especially lunar ones, scared the cheese out of medieval populations. People believed the moon was being eaten, sometimes by dragons, sometimes by wolves, occasionally by a deeply unsatisfied sky ghost with dietary issues. Astrologers? Oh, they loved this stuff. Lunar eclipses gave them weeks of relevance. Entire prophecies revolved around what it meant when the moon disappeared for an hour. Was it signaling a plague, a royal betrayal, a tax hike? Frankly, the third one was the worst. In villages across Europe and Asia, people would bang pots and pans, scream at the sky, or light fires to scare off the moon eaters. Some fasted, others feasted. One town even released hundreds of doves during an eclipse in hopes that bird vibes would reverse the damage. Historians still argue whether this helped or just caused a lot of guano. Meanwhile, the astrologers stood confidently in the town square, arms raised like weather vanes. This eclipse, they declared, signals the end of an era. Then they'd clarify. Though which era exactly, we're not sure. Possibly just the goat census cycle. You try to go about your day, but it's hard when the baker has declared his rye loaves cursed by shadow. He's wrapped each one in rosemary and won't sell them until the moon reemerges. The local barber has canceled all appointments. No cutting while the moon is weeping, he says solemnly, as if hair follicles care about celestial grief. What's truly fascinating is how eclipses appeared in multiple cultures as cosmic resets. Ancient Mesopotamians believed a lunar eclipse foretold the death of a king. They often appointed a mock king to take the hit. This poor guy got fancy clothes, decent meals, and then, well, let's just say retirement came fast, and with a ceremonial dagger. Chinese astronomers recorded eclipses meticulously, linking them with imperial fortunes. If an eclipse wasn't predicted correctly, the chief astrologer could be fired or beheaded, sometimes both, depending on how moody the emperor was feeling and whether Mercury was also retrograde. But in Europe, especially during the late Middle Ages, eclipses became emotional events. People genuinely believed these cosmic hiccups impacted everything, from harvests to fertility. Entire weddings were postponed because the moon was swallowed and cannot bless this union. A bit dramatic, but honestly poetic. There's even a tale from Florence in 1311 where a merchant blamed a lunar eclipse for his failed shipment of saltfish. The moon devoured my profits, he cried. His accountant suggested perhaps it had more to do with his decision to store the fish next to a blacksmith's forge. Still, eclipses offered astrologers a dramatic stage. They'd stand in front of maps of the heavens, point at orbs, and say things like, "This shadow reveals hidden truths," which mostly meant people would start accusing each other of theft, witchcraft, or mislabeling jam jars. For all the fear, eclipses were weirdly democratic. Everyone saw the same thing. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, you looked up, and there it was. A celestial event too big to ignore, too eerie to fully understand, and too tempting not to assign meaning. You stroll through the village as the shadow fades. The moon reappears, shy and glowing, like it just remembered it left the oven on. The townspeople cheer. The monk stops gnawing parchment. Someone starts playing a flute very badly. And the astrologer? He wipes his brow, nods to the crowd, and says, "I told you it would pass," as foretold in the sixth quadrant of the upper sphere, which, if you're honest, sounds like something he made up on the spot while trying to hide behind a goose. You shake your head, but even you feel a little lighter. Maybe it's not about truth or science. Maybe it's about feeling like the stars are trying to tell you something, even if what they're saying is, take a nap. You're dramatic today. So you do. You curl up with a blanket, the faint smell of rosemary bread in the air, and the moon safely returned from its snack break. The sky has stopped panicking. The astrologers are back to muttering about Saturn. And you? You sleep better knowing the moon is still exactly where you left it. You're ankle deep in mud, holding a turnip, and staring into the cloudy sky like it just insulted your mother. A storm is coming, or so says the village astrologer, who has been glaring at Jupiter all morning and muttering about trouble in the water signs. You were hoping for sunshine. The sheep were hoping for sunshine. Even the turnip was hopeful. But no, the heavens have other plans. Back in the day, people didn't check weather apps. They checked astrologers. And not just casually. Entire harvests, festivals, and fishing trips were planned based on whether Venus was smiling or sulking. You wouldn't dare sail to Crete if Mars was looking twitchy. No one wanted to risk being struck by a mood of the heavens, which sounds like a poem, but often resulted in mildew. Here's the twist: astrology and meteorology used to be the same job. For centuries, predicting the weather meant studying star charts, not clouds. Your local astrologer was also your weatherman, and occasionally your marriage counselor and chicken therapist, depending on the week. They believed the planets controlled the elements. Mars was hot and dry. The moon was cold and moist. Jupiter was warm and moist, which frankly makes him sound like a casserole. And when these planets interacted, they stirred up weather like cranky baristas, frothing seasonal storms. Historians still debate just how accurate these forecasts were, or whether people just pretended to see patterns so the astrologers wouldn't get pouty. What we do know: a number of ancient and medieval texts treat celestial positions as crucial to understanding the atmosphere. If the moon was in Cancer, expect humidity. If Saturn entered Aries, brace for cold winds, sinus complaints, and vaguely tragic poetry. There's a delightful case from 11th century Persia where a traveling astrologer claimed that Jupiter's influence would bring a season of generous rains and mild afternoons. What followed was one of the driest summers on record, during which local poets coined the phrase Jupiter's cruel joke. The astrologer quietly left town under cover of fog, or possibly just very bad timing. Sometimes the weather actually matched the prediction. A Roman general delayed his campaign by 3 days because an astrologer foresaw lightning striking from a wounded sky. Sure enough, on day 2, a bolt took out the campaign's soup tent. No one was hurt, but morale dropped significantly when the soldiers realized they'd have to eat cold lentils for a week. Of course, mistakes happened, lots of them. There's a story from 14th century Bohemia in which a court astrologer confidently declared that no rain shall fall for 13 days. On day 2, the king's birthday parade was rained out so hard, the royal band floated down the street on their own sheet music. The astrologer claimed it was symbolic rain and blamed Mercury for miscommunicating. Still, for most people, astrology-based forecasts were better than nothing. They were certainly more dramatic. You didn't just get partly cloudy with a chance of drizzle. You got Mars is displeased with the grain merchants and Neptune whispers of fog. It turned every picnic into a thrilling act of cosmic rebellion. You remember one market day when the sky looked suspiciously cheerful, but the astrologer warned of wind possessed by the ghost of Saturn. Everyone wore extra scarves. Nothing happened, except one cart lost its wheel and rolled into a fountain, which was quickly declared a manifestation of air spirits. Even royal courts took this seriously. Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire employed astrologers specifically to tell him when the weather would be good enough to walk in the gardens. If the stars didn't cooperate, he'd cancel outdoor meetings, and once postponed a treaty signing because Venus was too damp. But astrology's grip on the forecast wasn't eternal. Slowly, people began comparing predictions with reality. Astronomers started measuring wind, recording temperatures, and shockingly, using observation. By the 17th century, astrology's influence over weather was waning, though a few diehards still insisted that hailstorms were lunar tantrums. One charming footnote: in Renaissance England, there were almanacs filled with month-by-month forecasts, like July moist Saturn grumbles, good for beans. People swore by them, even when they got it wrong. One farmer wrote in the margin, "Saturn lied, beans died." Even now, echoes of those old beliefs linger. Some folks still swear the moon affects their mood, their haircuts, or their tomato yields. And while modern meteorologists don't consult Neptune, they do get blamed just as often when your picnic is rained out. As the clouds roll in over your muddy shoes, you consider the irony. The astrologer told you not to plant today. You didn't listen. Now the wind's picked up, the sheep are fleeing, and your turnip? It's somehow on fire. You squint at the sky and mutter, "All right, Mars, you win this round." You're crouched behind a velvet curtain in a very echoey hallway, holding your breath while two astrologers argue about Venus's emotional availability. Across the room, a duke leans in, trying to pretend he's not eavesdropping, even though he's basically folded in half behind a plant. This is no ordinary stargazing session. This is court intrigue, astrology edition. You see, in medieval courts, astrologers weren't just there to predict good days for tournaments or tell you when to stop eating onions. They were also, how should we put this, strategic information assets, or, if you prefer the non poetic version, spies. The logic was simple. If you could read the stars, maybe you could also read people. If you were already listening to everyone's problems, fears, and romantic disasters disguised as horoscope consultations, well, you might as well pass a few notes to the local lord. Some courts, especially in Italy and the Islamic Golden Age, turned astrology into a full-blown intelligence operation. Astrologers tracked celestial omens and political gossip. They'd whisper things like, "Mars is stirring tension between allies," when what they really meant was, "The ambassador from Naples is secretly furious you sat him next to the goat pen." There's even evidence that some astrologers manipulated horoscopes on purpose to sway decisions. If the king was unsure about invading a neighbor, an astrologer might tweak the chart just slightly to say, "Ah, yes, Jupiter supports conquest this month. Also, don't trust your brother in law." Historians still argue over whether these astrologers were conscious manipulators or just extremely persuasive believers. But one thing's clear: astrologers often held influence far beyond their official roles. Some even served as advisors to kings, not because they were experts in war, but because they understood timing, psychology, and how to say, "Wait one more week," in 17 astrological metaphors. And if they needed someone discredited, easy. Whisper that his Mercury is out of alignment, suggest that Neptune is influencing his rash decisions, or just imply his natal chart suggests restless ambition and a tendency to poison salads. You didn't need facts, you had charts. One case from 15th century Milan involved an astrologer predicting danger from the west on the exact day a diplomat from Spain arrived. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the astrologer saw the diplomat getting too cozy with the Duchess and decided to tip the political scale a bit. You, dear listener, are now caught in this tangle of planetary espionage. Your job is to assist with celestial documentation, which mostly means fetching ink, pretending to understand Latin, and occasionally giving side eye to anyone whose rising sign looks suspicious. But you've overheard things, secrets disguised as omens. "Beware the lion under the crescent moon," someone says, and you're pretty sure they mean Duke Lorenzo, who has a lion embroidered on everything, including his nightgown. The lion part, not the crescent, though that's probably embroidered too. It's not just the Italians either. In the Abbasid Caliphate, court astrologers were often mathematicians and scholars, deeply respected and terrifyingly clever. Some even wrote secret reports on political enemies using coded astronomical metaphors. Saturn's heaviness afflicts the eastern wing might translate to your cousin is definitely plotting something shady near the spice route. Meanwhile, in England, astrologers were often caught between real political danger and theatrical nonsense. One poor soul named Simon was asked to explain why the king's pigeons refused to nest. His answer involved Venus, a solar cusp, and the possibility of divine frustration over unpaid taxes. The pigeons never came back, but Simon got promoted. Naturally, not everyone trusted the astrologers. Some nobles saw them as meddling gossips with fancy charts. Others kept multiple astrologers and compared predictions, like they were shopping for omens at a royal discount store. This one says war, that one says peace. The third one just keeps crying and drawing Saturn with devil horns. Let's go with war. Of course, the astrologers had their own networks. They gossiped, compared charts, and occasionally sabotaged one another. A famous feud in Prague began when two astrologers accused each other of chart falsification. One claimed the other's moon was not in Scorpio. Insults were exchanged. Parapets were involved. No one remembers who won, but both horoscopes were mysteriously wet for weeks. You begin to wonder whether astrology is just a cover, a cloak of legitimacy for some very human maneuvering. After all, when people believe in the stars, it becomes easier to guide them, suggest, influence, nudge. You try to warn your boss, but he just waves you off. Mars is in Leo, he says. Everyone's dramatic right now. You're not sure if he means the court or just himself, so you keep fetching the ink. Keep listening behind tapestries. Keep noting that Duke Lorenzo's ill-favored Mars aspects always seem to coincide with his request to marry richer widows. And when someone asks what the stars say today, you smile, lean in, and whisper, "The skies are turbulent. Trust must be earned. And maybe, don't eat anything with parsley." The curtain rustles. The Duke sighs. Somewhere in the castle, the astrologers are back to their charts, one eye on the heavens, the other on everyone's dirty laundry. You're sipping a thin cup of watered wine in a shadowy alcove, trying not to draw attention to yourself, because across the hall sits His Holiness, surrounded by advisors, incense, and a suspiciously large number of star charts for someone who's publicly declared astrology a pagan temptation. Yes, tonight we find ourselves in the grand holy paradox of the Pope who reads his horoscope. Now, to be clear, the official church stance for centuries was firm. Astrology is heresy, witchcraft, dangerous, and definitely not to be read before breakfast. The stars were made by God, yes, but using them to predict who you should marry, when to harvest beets, or whether to take up embroidery on a Tuesday, absolutely not. And yet, behind closed cathedral doors, papal chambers often hid charts, compasses, and tired astrologers muttering about Saturn's bone-dry energy again. One of the best-known examples comes from Pope Sixtus IV in the 15th century. Publicly, he condemned astrology. Privately, he kept court astrologers. And he wasn't the only one. Pope Julius II consulted astrologers for military timing. Pope Leo X scheduled some of his decisions according to celestial advice. Just, discreetly. Historians still argue whether this was hypocrisy, political pragmatism, or just a desperate need for someone to tell them when to stop launching crusades and start taking naps. You, of course, have stumbled into this world entirely by accident. Your job was to deliver candles. Now you're stuck behind a curtain, watching a cardinal squint at a moon chart and whisper, "Today is not a day for papal decrees. The moon is in Scorpio, and we've all been feeling a bit testy. Even in Rome, the stars had a strange pull. Clerics weren't blind to the usefulness of astrology. After all, if emperors were consulting star readers, the church didn't want to be left out of the loop. Some theologians tried to reconcile astrology with Christian doctrine, insisting the stars weren't controlling us, just offering suggestions, cosmic recommendations, if you will. By the 13th century, universities like Bologna and Paris offered astrology as part of the curriculum, tucked safely within the study of medicine and philosophy. Purely academic, they insisted, while quietly sneaking horoscopes into political letters. Even St. Thomas Aquinas, the guy who basically wrote the manual on medieval theology, acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, the stars influence the physical world. Not your soul, of course, but your body, your mood, your tendency to trip over buckets during full moons. Sure, that was fair game. Meanwhile, astrologers working for the church had to walk a very delicate tightrope. Too accurate, and they risked suspicion. Too vague, and they were useless. The sweet spot was something like Jupiter favors peace, but beware Mars's sharp tongue. It sounded holy, mysterious, and entirely non committal. But make no mistake, some of these guys were rock stars. One papal astrologer named Lucius was so popular that bishops would send him pastries in exchange for brief and gentle readings about whether their sermons were aligned with the heavens. He once predicted a solar eclipse with such flair that people swore the sky darkened out of respect. You get the feeling that if astrology hadn't been frowned upon, Lucius would have had his own line of holy water perfumes and zodiac themed cassocks. Of course, when things went wrong, astrologers became convenient targets. In 1348, when the Black Death swept across Europe, many blamed planetary alignments, particularly a conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter in Aquarius. Astrologers were summoned. Some were revered. Others were executed for not warning everyone sooner. One papal advisor reportedly exclaimed, "The stars foretold this plague, but we were distracted by Venus's glowing optimism." Venus, for the record, has been scapegoated for many things over the centuries, including plague, poor harvests, and one regrettable opera. You're now seated quietly in the back of a papal briefing, pretending to polish a candelabra while secretly listening to a debate about whether next month's Easter sermon should be delayed due to a troublesome trine. One bishop is panicking, another suggests fasting. The Pope sips tea and finally says, "Let us wait and see what Mercury decides." You drop your cloth. Did he just say that out loud? But no one reacts. It's as if everyone has agreed that technically astrology is bad, unless it's useful, or poetic, or mildly flattering. Even Gregorian calendar reform, yes, the very way we measure time, had input from astronomers and astrologers alike. If the stars could help calculate Easter, they could help plan anything. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson. Astrology, for all its contradictions, gave people a way to organize chaos, to tame time, to feel like the universe wasn't just a spinning mess of pain and tax increases. The stars may not have held divine authority in the eyes of the church, but they held something, enough to consult, enough to fear, enough to peek at, right after confession. So when you finally leave the Vatican, candles delivered and secrets absorbed, you glance up at the sky and smile. No one will admit it, but you just watched the Pope reschedule a sermon because of Neptune. And somehow, that feels just right. You're lying flat on a wooden bench, staring at the ceiling of a medieval infirmary, which smells like rosemary, vinegar, and just a whisper of burnt socks. A man in a lopsided hat peers at your tongue, then steps back and announces, We'll need to wait until the moon is in Taurus before draining your fluids. You are not reassured. Welcome to the world of medical astrology, where your spleen, your stars, and your barber surgeon all have equal say in your diagnosis. In this reality, it's not just what you're sick with, it's when you're sick with it, and under which celestial mood swing. It sounds absurd now, but for centuries, astrology was medicine's cosmic twin. Every respectable physician carried a star chart alongside their leeches. They believed that the position of the planets at the moment of your birth, plus their current alignments, influenced your humors. The lovely medieval theory that your health was governed by black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Think of it as medieval WebMD with more goat fat. The moon was especially meddlesome. If it was waning, certain treatments were avoided. If it was full, everyone acted weird anyway. So doctors just recommended staying indoors and praying aggressively. And Mercury? Mercury got blamed for everything from nosebleeds to bad dreams to the patient's inability to stop singing during dinner. One famous medical text from the 1400s warns, do not lance boils on the right side of the body while the moon is in Leo, which honestly sounds like advice you'd find in a very niche wellness blog. Historians still debate whether the astrologers actually believed in these systems or whether they were just following the expectations of the time. After all, if your patient demanded a diagnosis involving Jupiter, it was probably easier to point to the stars than explain bacterial infection, especially when the word bacteria hadn't been invented yet. But this wasn't just for peasants. Royal physicians used astrology regularly. Queen Elizabeth I had her chart consulted before medical decisions. So did emperors, popes, and wealthy merchants. If you had money, you expected your doctor to align your leechings with lunar phases. Anything less was just lazy medicine. You remember hearing about a patient in Florence who insisted his liver disorder could only be treated when Venus aligned with his natal Mars. He delayed treatment for 3 weeks, during which he felt progressively worse but cosmically justified. He eventually recovered, probably because the doctor just gave him wine and told him Saturn had approved. And then there were surgical decisions. You might think, surely they'd operate based on urgency. But no, not without checking the sky first. If Mars was in a cranky house, no knives. If Mercury was retrograde, maybe don't perform eye surgery. If the moon was in Pisces, well, some thought you were basically waterlogged and uncooperative. In 13th century Paris, there's a documented case of a university-trained physician refusing to amputate a nobleman's infected toe until the moon exited Aries. The nobleman agreed. The toe did not survive, but the chart, apparently, was immaculate. Astrological anatomy was also a thing. Each sign of the zodiac governed a different body part. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces, who got the feet and occasionally corns, according to one snide astrologer's note. So, a Leo with a stomach ache? Suspicious. Virgo with a rash? Cosmic justice. Scorpio with, you guessed it, anything awkwardly personal, was cause for both herbal treatment and discreet eyebrow raises. Medical charts looked like giant starfish with human organs painted on. Doctors would wave a pointer around like, ah, yes, your spleen is under Sagittarius's influence. Bad month for digestion. Meanwhile, you're just hoping they wash their hands, which, spoiler alert, they did not. And heaven forbid you ignore astrological advice. One physician was fired from a Bavarian court because he prescribed bloodletting during a waning moon. The nobleman got a cold. The doctor got escorted out. The moon continued waning, smug and unbothered. Even births were micromanaged by the cosmos. Midwives consulted lunar calendars before deciding the best time to cut the cord. A baby born under a fiery sign like Aries or Leo might be predicted to become bold, ambitious, and very dramatic about teething. If born under Cancer, probably clingy, possibly allergic to goats. Again, very niche predictions. Of course, not everyone followed these rules. Some physicians, especially in the late Renaissance, began to quietly abandon astrology in favor of anatomy and dissection, but they had to do it gently, so as not to alarm their patients. We're just confirming Mars's opinion by looking at your gallbladder, they'd say, scalpel already in hand. The overlap between mysticism and medicine wasn't unique to Europe. In India, Ayurvedic practitioners often incorporated astrological timing into treatments. In China, certain acupuncture points were considered more effective when harmonized with the lunar cycle. The idea that the heavens affect the body wasn't just a European fever dream, it was a global fascination. You shift slightly on your bench as the astrologer physician returns. He waves some smoke in your face, checks a brass sundial, and finally declares, "The moon is favorable now. We may begin draining the melancholy." You nod, even though you're not entirely sure what melancholy is or where it's stored, but if it means fewer vinegar, compresses, and more soup, you're all in. Because in this world, healing isn't just physical, it's planetary. And sometimes, the best medicine is knowing the moon approves of your bandages. You're standing in front of a mirror that might actually be polished tin, trying to comb your hair with something that might have once been a fork. Nothing's working. Your bangs are rebellious. Your eyebrows are staging a coup. You sigh. "Must be Mercury retrograde," someone mutters behind you. You turn around. It's the apothecary's apprentice, clutching a crushed pomegranate and looking like someone just told him his goat joined a monastery. "Retrograde again," he says. "That's why my stew exploded, and why I accidentally dyed my beard green." Ah yes, retrogrades. Those heavenly hiccups that medieval astrologers absolutely adored. The word itself comes from Latin retrogradus, meaning backward step, and backward they went. Planets like Mercury, Mars, and Venus appearing to reverse direction across the night sky, thanks to some harmless orbital illusions. Today, we understand it's just geometry, but back then, pure chaos. Mercury retrograde, in particular, got a terrible reputation. It was blamed for miscommunication, broken contracts, lost chickens, bad handwriting, incorrect horoscopes, stubbed toes, and the general unraveling of social decorum. It didn't help that Mercury governed travel, speech, and trade. So, if your ox cart crashed into a fountain, your letter never arrived, or your marketplace haggle turned into a fistfight, well, Mercury was obviously drunk again. Historians still argue how early this reputation began, but by the 14th century, you couldn't swing a lute without someone muttering about a retrograde. Astrologers printed pamphlets warning of disruption, deception, and dampness. That last one is still unexplained. The really dramatic astrologers warned against signing anything during Mercury retrograde. No contracts, no treaties, not even a birthday card. In Florence, one merchant refused to finalize a trade deal until the stars corrected themselves. His cargo of apples rotted waiting for celestial cooperation. It wasn't just Mercury, though. Mars in retrograde? That meant aggression turned inward. People picked fights with themselves. Literally. One night reportedly challenged his own reflection to a duel. His squire had to talk him down with warm ale and a surprisingly gentle sonnet. Venus retrograde, on the other hand, wreaked havoc on love lives. Marriages soured, affairs were discovered. One astrologer claimed that Venus retrograde in Scorpio caused sudden, unjustified loathing of perfectly good husbands. Another blamed it for a noblewoman's sudden infatuation with a blacksmith's apprentice and her subsequent attempt to elope via turnip cart. Even fashion was not safe. Venus retrograde coincided with regrettable haircuts, impromptu beard styles, and at least one high profile scandal involving a crushed velvet cloak and a goat. You remember attending a village council meeting where no one could agree on anything budget, grain storage, or what color the new flag should be. The clerk, red faced and covered in ink smudges, finally stood up and screamed, "Mercury is retrograde. Nothing means anything. Let me go home." He was granted early leave. The flag was never made. Astrologers didn't just warn of retrogrades, they capitalized on them. One group in Nuremberg published retrograde survival guides, featuring tips like avoid traveling across rivers, don't name any new pets, steer clear of dramatic declarations, and strong cheeses. Some of these were later reused in modern dating apps. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman court, astrologers were so revered that when a retrograde coincided with a broken aqueduct, a royal astrologer was summoned to interrogate the skies. He did, and came back with Venus regrets her decisions and seeks solitude. Water was restored the next day. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the astrologer got a new turban. In England, astrologers used retrogrades to explain everything from failed theater openings to spoiled herring. One dramatic bard blamed Mercury, retrograde, for an entire week of bad reviews. The stars, he claimed, are unkind to iambic pentameter. Audiences remained unamused. You walk past the town square now and see a sign posted, "Due to Mercury's current path, all debates are postponed. Arguing resumes next Thursday." Below it, someone scribbled, "Thank the stars," in chalk. Even midwives timed births around retrogrades. "You don't want a Mercury baby," one would whisper. "They talk too much, walk into doors, and forget birthdays." Oddly specific, possibly based on her nephew. But despite the fear, retrogrades also became a kind of cosmic scapegoat. Forgot your rent? Retrograde. Lost your shoe? Retrograde. Burned the stew again? Blame the stars, not your questionable stirring technique. And like all scapegoats, it brought people comfort, a sense that their chaos wasn't random, it was written in the stars. The universe wasn't punishing you, it was just misaligned, temporarily glitching, like a divine hiccup. You glance up at the stars now, the night calm and twinkling. Retrograde? You ask a passing astrologer. He checks his chart, sighs dramatically, and mutters, "Yes, all of them." So you nod, tie your shoes backward for luck, and decide maybe today isn't the day to confess your love, sign a lease, or bake anything more complex than boiled oats. Because if the planets are moonwalking, it's probably best not to sprint. You've been invited to a wedding feast. There's roast pheasant, fiddle music, and someone dramatically fanning themselves with a menu because Venus is in retrograde and emotions are volatile. You smile politely, then notice the bride is crying. Not softly, loudly. Like someone just told her Mars insulted her shoes. Turns out he sort of did. Welcome to the world of zodiac dating disasters, where medieval courtships weren't built on romance, compatibility, or even shared interest in goat herding, but entirely on the stars. Specifically, whether Venus was feeling cooperative, Saturn was looking judgmental, and Mercury wasn't too busy being chaotic. Astrologers were matchmakers before Tinder existed, except instead of swiping right, you consulted a hand copied scroll, a complicated planetary alignment chart, and the mood of Jupiter in the 12th house, which is somehow both vague and terrifying. It started with birth charts. Everyone had one. Where the planets were at, your birth supposedly dictated not just your personality, but your romantic viability. Were you born under Libra? Ooh, charming, balanced, maybe a bit indecisive. Scorpio? Passionate, secretive, possibly a witch. Taurus? Great cook, suspicious of strangers, owns too many blankets. Historians still debate how seriously people took these charts, though there's solid evidence from royal archives that marriages were postponed, arranged, or canceled entirely based on star based incompatibility. You remember one story from 15th century Burgundy. A noblewoman refused to marry a perfectly eligible duke because his Mars was square her Venus. Translation: passionate arguments, emotional instability, and probably a terrible co parenting situation. She instead married a man whose Jupiter was trine her moon, and while no one could explain what that meant, they did have matching cloaks and 8 children. Astrology wasn't just used to judge potential spouses, it was used to pick when to propose, when to consummate, and even when to argue. Seriously, there are manuscripts with instructions like avoid confrontations while the moon wanes, lest your love sour like milk in the sun. Astrologers made a tidy profit from these romantic readings. In Renaissance Italy, it became fashionable to give your beloved a gift with their horoscope attached. Nothing says, I care, like a diagram of their birth stars, annotated with phrases like Venus afflicted and prone to seasonal melancholy. One nobleman reportedly gave his fiancée a poem that read, Thine moon, conjunct my Mars, O celestial delight, let us wed ere Saturn doth frown. She married someone else, possibly because he also gave her a goat. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of a personal astrologer, but that didn't stop common folk from blaming the stars for heartbreak. A peasant girl in Lincolnshire once insisted her lover ghosted her because the stars forbade it. He later confessed he just didn't like walking up hills. Still, the belief ran deep. In Poland, a farmer refused to marry a woman because her rising sign was Capricorn, and he'd heard Capricorns don't respect onions. This may sound absurd now, but in a society where everything else was dictated by fate, why not love? And if things went wrong, there was always someone to blame: Mercury, or Mars, or that sketchy eclipse that happened during your engagement. One widow blamed her husband's infidelity on Neptune's influence over his judgment. Neptune wasn't discovered yet, but the astrologer nodded solemnly. It wasn't all nonsense. Some astrologers genuinely tried to use personality based logic, linking planetary traits to behavior. They may have accidentally invented the earliest version of relationship counseling. Your partner is a Leo? Compliment their mane and give them space to roar. Honestly, not bad advice. But things got out of hand. In 1523, a group of bachelors in Paris staged a protest, claiming there were too many Cancerians in the dating pool and demanded better astrological balance. No one took them seriously, especially not the Cancerians, who cried and wrote moving poetry about it. Astrology based matchmaking continued well into the Enlightenment. Even as science advanced, people still peeked at horoscopes before attending dances. One gentleman refused to waltz with a Gemini unless a Virgo was present to balance the airiness. He was hit with a shoe. You think back to that wedding feast. The bride, born under Aquarius, had been told by her astrologer that her groom, an Aries, would ignite her inner chaos. She assumed that meant passion. Turns out, it meant 2 months of arguing about curtain fabrics. But here's the thing: astrology gave people permission to hope, to hesitate, to laugh. It wrapped the terrifying uncertainty of love in celestial logic, and that made things feel less random. So, when your neighbor asks if they should pursue the fishmonger with a very Gemini energy, you nod sagely and say, only if his Saturn respects your Venus. It sounds profound. It buys them time, and maybe, just maybe, it keeps them from another turnip cart heartbreak. You're ankle deep in straw, watching three men build a boat in the middle of a wheat field. It is not raining. There is no river. One of the men is wearing a saucepan for a helmet. You ask what they're doing. Preparing for the flood, the saucepan replies. You blink. What flood? He looks skyward with mild despair. The stars, he says, they've made it very clear. February 1524. The world will drown. The astrologers have spoken. Ah, yes. Welcome to the delightful panic of the great flood that never happened, courtesy of astrology-fueled doomsday predictions. It all started with a perfectly innocent, read terrifying, planetary alignment. In February 1524, an impressive 10 planets and celestial bodies, including Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, were predicted to converge in the sign of Pisces. Pisces, if you don't follow astrological weather alerts, is a water sign. That's right. 10 celestial heavyweights in a sign associated with oceans, floods, tears, and that one time you cried because a pigeon looked at you funny. To astrologers of the time, this alignment wasn't just interesting, it was ominous, especially given that many of them believed planetary conjunctions in water signs heralded, well, water, floods, torrents, biblical scale sogginess. One particularly influential astrologer, Johannes Sturfler, predicted that this alignment would trigger a world-drowning flood. People took him very seriously because nothing screams trustworthy like a man with a large beard and access to star maps. Historians still argue over how many people truly believed the prophecy, but the reaction was real. People built arks, multiple arks. A German count named von Igelheim constructed an actual wooden vessel and loaded it with animals, food, and probably way too much cheese. On the day of the predicted flood, February 20th, 1524, crowds gathered, some to watch, some to beg for seats on the ark, and some to sell snacks. When it didn't rain, the crowd grew restless. Then someone threw a turnip. Then someone else threw a priest. It all went downhill from there. The non-flood led to riots, property damage, and widespread embarrassment for astrologers. One reportedly locked himself in a shed for a week and refused to speak to anyone except his cat. Another insisted the real flood was spiritual and everyone should feel ashamed for doubting him. You walk through town now and spot a broken sign hanging off the town square gate. No boats during Mercury retrograde. It seems the locals learned something. But this wasn't the first time celestial doom had been forecast. In ancient Rome, eclipses and comets were regularly cited as signs of apocalyptic events. One historian in the 2nd century AD wrote that a particularly bright comet meant the empire will fracture, or perhaps everyone will get indigestion, both as it happened. In 1186, another planetary alignment was predicted to end the world. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But monks across Europe still hoarded supplies and copied Bibles extra fast. just in case literacy didn't survive the tsunami. And comets, don't even get people started. Those flaming space noodles were seen as terrible omens. More on that later. Back in 1524, astrologers scrambled to explain the dry skies. Some claimed they'd miscalculated by a few decades. Others said the people had repented just in time and diverted the wrath of the stars. One bold astrologer claimed the flood had, in fact, occurred, but only on an astral plane that no one could see without proper eyewear. The public, however, wasn't pleased. Astrological credibility took a serious hit. In fact, part of the reason astrology became associated with quacks and charlatans in the Enlightenment was because of this very non flood. Still, the panic had its perks. Several towns reinforced their bridges. A few panicked nobles rewrote their wills. One enterprising peasant made a fortune selling water resistant cloaks, which turned out to be just regular cloaks. Even the church chimed in, insisting that no amount of stargazing could predict divine wrath, which, coming from an institution that sometimes hired astrologers privately, was rich. You chuckle now as you pass an abandoned barn with faded paint reading Noah 2.0, reserved, seating only. Someone clearly believed, and maybe, in a strange way, it wasn't all foolishness. The stars offered people a story, a pattern in the chaos, a cosmic weather report for the soul. Yes, they got the forecast wrong, but they built boats. They made plans. They prepared. You sit on a dry hillside under a dry sky, listening to the wind rustle through dry grass, and think, sometimes people would rather fear the stars than admit they have no idea what's coming. And really, who among us hasn't packed an emotional boat or two just in case? You're walking through a bustling ancient market, dodging goats, flatbread vendors, and a man shouting something about Jupiter being on sale. That's right, Jupiter. For only 2 silver coins. Guaranteed to bring wealth, success, and excellent digestion. You are now squarely in the middle of horoscope scams, circa 2,000 years ago. Because where there's belief in destiny, there's always someone trying to monetize it. Astrology was never just about stars. It was also a business. A noisy, chaotic, incense-scented business full of promises, parchments, and the occasional glowing crystal that may or may not be a polished beat. People wanted good omens, and they were willing to pay for them, especially the rich ones, who tended to believe Jupiter favored their bank accounts. The ancient Babylonians were among the first to use astrology systematically. They also happened to invent receipts. Coincidence? Maybe. But by the time of the Roman Empire, astrological consultation had become a full-blown industry. Historians still debate just how personalized these readings really were. Sure, some astrologers studied horoscopes in earnest, but many operated more like performance artists with excellent robes. A rich merchant walks in, asks about his fortune, and leaves convinced that Mars has approved of his barley investments. Meanwhile, the astrologer pockets a generous tip and adds barley expert to his resume. You, meanwhile, have just passed a stall with a painted sign, Fortune Boosts, Mercury neutral, today only. The vendor winks and offers you a wax seal, infused with Venus's approval. It smells like beeswax and something vaguely minty. You buy it anyway. Why not? In Roman marketplaces, you could pay to have your birth chart interpreted by a priestly astrologer, or at least someone wearing enough linen to look legitimate. Need luck in love? That'll be 1 coin. Want to avoid a bad harvest? 3 coins. Desperate to know if your mother-in-law is plotting against you? That's a deluxe chart and a cup of wine. Even emperors fell for it. Emperor Tiberius famously had a personal astrologer, Thrasyllus, who once saved his own life by correctly predicting that Tiberius would survive a voyage he hadn't even planned yet. Tiberius was so impressed, he hired him for life and possibly gave him beachfront property. But not all astrologers were lucky. Those caught faking charts, or worse, predicting bad omens for powerful people, could find themselves exiled, jailed, or gently thrown into a moat. That's why some astrologers learn to phrase their predictions very carefully. Jupiter smiles upon your endeavors, provided you remain humble and avoid cheese. The stars offer strong energy today. Interpret as you wish. Saturn suggests patience, but also maybe hiding indoors. By the Middle Ages, the scam side of astrology had expanded to include amulets, love powders, and zodiac blessed herbs. You could buy Mars infused iron for courage, moon charged silver for dreams, or a pouch of dried moss touched by Mercury himself. Mercury, for the record, lived 3 villages over and didn't touch anything. Astrology scams weren't limited to Europe. In ancient India, lucky dates were sold to nervous grooms. In China, some merchants claimed to use planetary alignments to determine rice pricing, though others just guessed and blamed it on Neptune. You recall one enterprising astrologer who claimed to sell wealth alignments by rearranging your furniture according to Venus's daily motion. He called it celestial spatial awareness. His customers called it, "Where did my chair go?" Not all scams were obvious. Some astrologers offered subscriptions. Send a coin every month, and they'd mail you your planetary forecast on a goatskin scroll. Many were accurate enough. If your prediction read, "Change is coming, avoid bold fashion," you were covered for most scenarios. One scholar in Alexandria started a side business crafting fake natal charts that guaranteed greatness. He sold one to a boy who grew up to be a pretty average scribe, but the chart gave him confidence, and confidence got him promoted, which proves the most powerful planet is self delusion. And let's not forget the astrology for hire crowd. In Florence, certain astrologers could be paid to declare your rivals cosmically cursed. Some would do it in verse, others with dramatic gestures and ominous herbs. One man had his ex business partner labeled born under a misaligned Uranus. No one knew what it meant, but it sounded bad. Of course, the best scams weren't even scams, they were just really good marketing. One astrologer wrote a best selling pamphlet called How to Harness Jupiter's Favor and Retire Before 30. It was mostly about prayer, vegetables, and strategic napping. Still, it outsold actual medical texts for a decade. You smile as you leave the market, your coin pouch lighter, your bag full of zodiac trinkets, and your heart oddly soothed. Sure, maybe it's nonsense, but it's personalized nonsense, and there's comfort in that. Besides, the moon is waxing, your Mars feels centered, and your Venus approved wax seal is sticking to everything you own. That's gotta be worth something. You're squinting through the early morning haze, watching a group of white robed priests march up temple steps with small bowls of incense, polished obsidian tablets, and something that might be a ceremonial cat. The air smells like frankincense and cooked onions. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where astrology wasn't just practiced, it was deified. Here, astrologers weren't dusty old men muttering about Jupiter behind taverns. They were high ranking temple functionaries, star priests, tasked with keeping the entire cosmos running on time and ensuring Pharaoh didn't stub his toe on the wrong moon phase. You see, the Egyptians didn't separate religion from astronomy. or from anything, really. If the Nile flooded too much, cosmic imbalance. If it didn't flood at all, you guessed it, someone ticked off Sirius. And if a hippo sneezed during a festival, it was probably Mercury being dramatic again. Among the celestial bodies, Sirius, known to them as Sopdet, held top billing. This star's heliacal rising, its first visible appearance before sunrise after disappearing for a time, coincided almost exactly with the annual flooding of the Nile. So naturally, the Egyptians decided Sirius was divine, powerful, glowy, potentially in charge of agricultural irrigation. Historians still debate whether Egyptian astrologers genuinely believed Sirius caused the Nile floods, or if they simply noticed the pattern and decided it looked good in gold leaf. Either way, Sirius became central to the Egyptian calendar and daily life. You, newly initiated into the temple as a scribe's assistant, are learning the star charts. They're carved into ceilings, columns, even spoons. You'll know when to pray, your mentor says, because the stars will remind you. Also, never take a bath when Mars is at zenith. Bad for the spleen. The deacons, or star groups, form the backbone of Egyptian nighttime timekeeping. Each deacon rose roughly every 10 days, making a stellar clock that the priests used to track hours in the night. Forget your phone. Your sleep schedule was ruled by whatever chunk of sky happened to be peeking over the horizon. In fact, the temples had entire rooms dedicated to star observation. Think early observatories, complete with carved notches, water clocks, and long, awkward silences, while everyone waited for Orion to do something. The Egyptians also believed that certain stars and planets influenced health and dreams. Got insomnia? You might be out of sync with Sirius. Nightmares about scorpions? Saturn? Weird rash shaped like a beetle? Definitely Venus. The cure was usually a mix of herbs, chants, and occasionally sleeping with your head facing east. There's a particularly charming record of a priest writing that dreams received while sleeping under a hostile star could cause erratic ambition and unfortunate fashion choices. This may explain why several tomb paintings show people wearing leopard skins and confused expressions. You look over your shoulder now as another priest places a bowl of milk under the moonlight. For clarity, he whispers, and smooth digestion, he pauses, and for avoiding drama at tomorrow's harvest ritual, you nod. Who doesn't want celestial digestive harmony? But astrology in Egypt wasn't all mysticism. It also had practical power. Temple astrologers advised on when to plant crops, when to build monuments, and when to launch boats down the Nile. Pharaohs consulted them before battles. Merchants asked for good shipping dates. Farmers begged for advice on goat fertility. One ambitious astrologer even developed a star calendar for teeth, where certain alignments were thought to cause cavities. He was not popular with bakers. Still, perhaps the most striking part of Egyptian astrology was how personal it became. Birth charts were sometimes etched onto amulets tied around infants' ankles or placed in tombs to help guide souls in the afterlife. A proper celestial escort was believed to prevent one from wandering into the realm of fish-headed gods or worse, paperwork. Astrologers also advised couples. If Venus was in Leo and the moon in Taurus, a marriage would be passionate, but messy. Mars in Cancer? Avoid at all costs. That union will end in soup-related tragedy. One papyrus notes. No further context is given. None is needed. And yes, astrologers charged for their services. Temple donations mostly. Bread, beer, the occasional cow. One particularly persuasive star priest was gifted a house for correctly predicting the birth of twins. The twins turned out to be cats, but by then, it was too awkward to revoke the deed. Even the Book of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian guide to navigating the afterlife, included star based directions. When you see Orion rise, walk 3 paces and turn left, it might as well say. If you messed up, eternal wandering, or worse, eternal meetings. You lie back on the temple roof now, watching Sirius glint over the horizon. The Nile is calm. The wind is warm. A cat settles on your chest and purrs, possibly enchanted, possibly just cozy. Tomorrow you'll help calculate a safe day to host a boat race, schedule a haircut, and bless a granary, all according to the sky. Because here in Egypt, the stars aren't just pretty, they're busy. They schedule your meals, your dreams, your emotional availability, and whether your neighbor's goose will survive molting season. And frankly, they're doing a better job than your village council. You're kneeling awkwardly on a silk rug in the middle of the Forbidden City, holding a scroll that might, just maybe, predict the downfall of an entire dynasty. No pressure. Welcome to the dizzying world of Chinese imperial astrology, where a misplaced comet could cost you your job, your honor, or, in some unlucky cases, your head. In ancient China, astrology wasn't just personal, it was political. The stars didn't whisper bedtime fortunes, they shouted warnings to emperors, to generals, to everyone who dared to stand in power under the heavens. Because in Chinese cosmology, the emperor wasn't just a king, he was the son of heaven, the bridge between earth and the celestial order. If something went wrong in the skies, an eclipse, a blood moon, a rogue planet, that wasn't just bad luck. It was a message from above. You've messed up, buddy. And who were the unlucky souls tasked with interpreting these divine Yelp reviews? The court astrologers, of course. Historians still argue whether imperial astrologers were more feared or pitied. On one hand, they were respected, often belonging to the royal observatory, trained in complex calculations and ancient texts. On the other hand, a wrong forecast could be interpreted as treason. If a rebellion broke out and you hadn't predicted it, well, say goodbye to your writing hand, or your family, or your entire ancestral home. You watch now as a senior astrologer traces the path of the moon with a long bronze pointer. He frowns. The others in the room shift uneasily. A comet has been seen over the northwest provinces, bright, fast, with a smoky tail. That could mean fire, war, or worse, administrative reorganization. One record from the Tang Dynasty describes a court astrologer being punished for failing to report a lunar eclipse. His defense? I sneezed and missed it. The emperor was not impressed. During the Han Dynasty, astrologers used a system known as the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, and the 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches to interpret cycles of time and fate. Combine these with observations of stars like Taiyi and Ziwei, and you get a cosmic bureaucracy more complicated than the empire itself. You recall one particularly memorable case. A total solar eclipse in 213 BCE caused Emperor Qin Shi Huang to cancel all public ceremonies and hide in his palace for days. The official astrologers were blamed, not for the eclipse, those happen, but for not warning him in time so he could schedule his mysterious illness. There was even a term for celestial disasters: Tianbian, heavenly changes. And when these were spotted, immediate action was expected. Punish a corrupt official, change tax laws, apologize publicly, fast for 3 days, sacrifice a goat, sacrifice 2 goats. You get the idea. But here's where things get delightfully strange. Some emperors would use astrology as an excuse to make political moves. The stars are restless, they declare, so I must replace my brother in law with someone who owes me money. Genius. Meanwhile, astrologers were caught in a dangerous loop. If they predicted a problem and one didn't occur, they risked ridicule. But if they failed to predict and something did, they risked much worse. The safest route? Vague forecasts. The stars are uneasy. Best not to sail. A dark wind stirs in the east. Avoid spicy food. A dragon star touches the oxen path. Review local bylaws. You spend your days surrounded by scrolls, maps, and nervous advisors. The Board of Astronomy, an actual imperial department, employs hundreds of workers to monitor the heavens. You've been asked to calculate Jupiter's movement this week because apparently Jupiter disapproves of budget meetings. The Emperor, who hasn't seen the sky in months, still insists on being informed. He believes quite sincerely that Mars's brightness foretells friction in the border provinces. And to be fair, sometimes he's not wrong. Historians note that major political upheavals did occasionally coincide with celestial events, which made astrology look suspiciously accurate. Of course, you know the truth. It's mostly clever pattern matching, but try telling that to a man with a golden throne and a temper problem. The astrologers were also responsible for managing the calendar, and not just for holidays. The entire agricultural cycle, planting, harvesting, festivals, was planned according to auspicious dates. Some days were good for travel, others for rest. And if you got married on an inauspicious Tiger Day, don't come crying to the heavens when your in laws move in permanently. You once watched a royal marriage rescheduled 3 times due to an uncooperative Venus. The bride wept. The groom ran away with a harpist. The stars, meanwhile, glowed indifferently. It wasn't all gloom and doom. Chinese astrology had its light side. Birth charts, known as bazi, were carefully calculated and treasured. These were said to reveal personality, destiny, even career suggestions. You are a wood goat with strong water influence. Consider becoming a potter. And people did. You lie back on the roof of the observatory now, watching clouds drift past stars with names like Heart of the Azure Dragon and Celestial Fox. Somewhere below, the Emperor dreams of immortality. His court dreams of favorable omens. You just hope tonight's comet doesn't signal another urgent decree. Because here in the Forbidden City, the stars don't just shine, they whisper, they judge, and sometimes they ruin your weekend plans. You're standing in a candlelit tent that smells like cinnamon, incense, and vague regret. A woman in a velvet turban waves her hands over your palm, glances up at the stars through a slit in the roof, and declares, "Oh dear, Saturn is watching you eat bread." You pause mid-bite. Welcome to the realm of traveling astrologers, those delightful cosmic consultants who roamed from town to town, part mystic, part therapist, part wandering philosopher, with a flair for velvet. In the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, not everyone had access to a temple observatory or a king's personal astrologer, but you could find someone willing to interpret your fate for a small fee, a piece of fruit, or a particularly shiny pebble. These astrologers didn't belong to any official guilds. They belonged to the roads and to every village that needed a dose of stardust and unsolicited advice. Historians still debate how much formal training these wanderers had. Some genuinely studied planetary motion, drew charts by candlelight, and memorized the writings of Ptolemy. Others had a slightly more relaxed approach. One man reportedly based his forecasts on the shape of clouds and how many times his goat sneezed. You watch now as one such astrologer sets up shop in the market square. A painted sign reads, Madame Celestina. Stars read, Spirits consulted, warts analyzed. She has one cloudy eye, 12 rings, and the confidence of someone who once convinced a mayor to build his house in a potato field because Mars required it. Her tent fills quickly. A farmer wants to know when to plant his beans. A baker wants to know if love is on the horizon. A very concerned gentleman wants to know why his ducks keep circling the same tree. Celestina checks her star chart, nods slowly, and whispers something about lunar interference and karmic breadcrumbs. The man leaves satisfied. The ducks remain confused. Wandering astrologers were often a mix of entertainers and advisors. They didn't just talk about planets, they told stories, interpreted dreams, and gave pep talks disguised as cosmic wisdom. Venus smiles upon your journey, they'd say, unless you pack too many spoons. Then she becomes vengeful. Many of these astrologers were women, which made them both popular and suspicious. Some were accused of witchcraft, especially if their predictions came true or if they owned more than one cat. One record describes a woman named Hester, the star whisperer, who was arrested for conjuring with Saturn. She was later released when it was discovered that Saturn was actually her pet duck. Despite the risks, these astrologers flourished. They were often more accessible than priests, more comforting than doctors, and infinitely more dramatic than local officials. Plus, they told you what you wanted to hear, with just enough mystery to keep you coming back. You sit now outside Celestina's tent, watching her draw birth charts with a stub of charcoal. You're a Taurus rising with Mars in Leo, she tells a nervous looking butcher. That explains the loud sneezing and your fear of buttons. He gasps. She winks. Everyone claps. It wasn't all harmless fun, of course. Some travelers used astrology as a cover for scams, selling protection charms, fake potions, or cosmic insurance plans. One infamous duo in Bohemia sold eclipse-proof cloaks, which were just regular cloaks dyed purple. When an eclipse did occur, they claimed success and vanished overnight. Others got involved in political drama. A traveling astrologer once declared that a local lord's child was born under a rebellious sign. The lord took this as a prophecy of mutiny, disinherited the child, and installed his niece as heir. The niece later ran off with a lute player, and the original child became a monk. The stars, as always, remained silent. Some regions tried to regulate astrologers, requiring licenses or official permits. This only made the traveling ones more appealing, more exotic, more dangerously honest. After all, if someone isn't tied to your village, they're more likely to tell you the truth, or at least a truth you haven't paid them to say yet. You recall a traveling astrologer who gave up forecasting entirely and became a professional reinterpreter. His entire business was explaining why last month's predictions didn't pan out. When Venus said new beginnings, she meant spiritually, not your goat business. And people bought it because at the heart of it all, traveling astrologers offered something precious, a sense of control, a whisper that your fate could be understood, managed, or even negotiated with if you just looked at the stars the right way. You lie on the grassy hill as the last stars emerge. Celestina has packed up. Her tent is gone. Only a faint trail of sandalwood lingers in the breeze. Tomorrow she'll be in the next town, telling someone else their Saturn is having mood swings and their left eyebrow is ruled by Pluto. And you? You feel oddly comforted because sometimes all it takes is one starry stranger, one velvet turban, and one cryptic forecast to make the world feel just a little more magical. Even if your ducks are still walking in circles, you're standing in a courtroom of all places, clutching a parchment birth chart like it's legal evidence, which, shockingly, it is. Across the room, a man accuses his neighbor of theft. The judge sighs, then gestures to the astrologer in the corner. Let's see what Mars has to say. Welcome to the delightful intersection of astrology and the justice system, where for a surprising stretch of history, the stars could help determine guilt, innocence, or whether you were simply having a very bad Saturn day. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly was, but records from medieval and early Renaissance Europe and bits of the Islamic Golden Age confirm that astrology occasionally wandered into courtrooms like a slightly drunk uncle at a wedding, uninvited, dramatic, and deeply committed to interpreting everything. It wasn't just personal disputes. Astrology influenced inheritance law, property arguments, and yes, compatibility cases. Because nothing says failed marriage like a judge reading aloud that your Venus is in opposition to your spouse's moon, and therefore you were cosmically doomed from day one. You shuffle your feet as the astrologer clears his throat. Your Honor, I have consulted the heavens. The defendant's Mercury was combust on the date in question. He could not have formed criminal intent. He was, astrologically speaking, confused. The judge nods solemnly. The crowd murmurs. Someone drops a cabbage. In 13th century Bologna, legal texts began referring to interrogations of the stars, where a chart was drawn for the exact moment a question was asked, like, did this man steal my ox? Or, is she telling the truth about the stolen pies? This wasn't seen as mystical. It was logic, according to the cosmos. In Spain, during the Moorish period, astrologers were occasionally called upon to determine the auspiciousness of punishment. One noble wanted to delay his execution because Saturn was in Leo, and that felt unflattering. The judge agreed, mostly because he didn't want bad omens on his resume. In other cases, people used astrology to prove innocence. One woman accused of poisoning her husband brought a chart showing Mars was well aspected in her sixth house, which governed health. Therefore, she couldn't possibly have harmed anyone. Her acquittal is still debated by scholars and astrologers. You flip through another scroll now, examining an 11th century French trial where a man's zodiac sign was used to explain his impulsivity. He's an Aries, the astrologer declared, impatient, prone to bad decisions, but ultimately harmless. The jury was unconvinced. He was fined 2 chickens and a wheelbarrow. Even contract disputes weren't immune. A London merchant once sued a tailor for delivering a robe a week late. The tailor argued that the delivery delay was due to Mercury's retrograde. The merchant insisted it was due to the tailor's hangover. The judge compromised. No payment, no robe, and a shared lecture on punctuality and planetary cycles. But perhaps the most charming example comes from a tiny court in Florence, where a couple sought annulment on the grounds of celestial incompatibility. Their astrologers presented charts. The husband's sun was in Aquarius, the wife's moon in Scorpio. They're emotionally out of sync, the astrologer explained. It's like pairing garlic and whipped cream. The judge, having recently divorced under similar claims, granted the annulment and advised both parties to avoid dating Geminis for a while. Not everyone approved, of course. Many scholars and clerics objected to mixing divine justice with planetary opinion. The church vacillated wildly. Some popes banned astrology altogether. Others quietly consulted it before making decisions. One pope reportedly postponed an excommunication because the moon was waxing. Another simply didn't trust Capricorns. You lean against a pillar now, watching as a scribe records the court astrologer's latest verdict. A young man accused of cheating at dice had his birth chart analyzed. Mars conjunct Uranus, the astrologer says, nodding. Reckless, possibly unlucky, but not criminal. The man is released. He immediately trips over a goat. The inclusion of astrology in court wasn't limited to Europe. In Persia, astrological omens were sometimes presented during trials as signs of divine approval or disapproval. One man tried to claim that a sudden thunderstorm proved his innocence. The judge agreed, possibly because he forgot his umbrella that day. In China, celestial signs were more often used after the fact, as justification for political moves, war, or pardons. The comet was angry, they'd say. We had to imprison Minister Wu. Poor Wu. Of course, the usefulness of astrology in court diminished with the rise of modern legal systems and science based reasoning. By the Enlightenment, most judges politely ignored astrologers or laughed them out of the room, but remnants of the belief persisted. Even in 19th century rural France, some records suggest villagers would delay testimony until a more favorable moon phase. I'll speak next Tuesday, one man insisted. My Saturn is less combative then. And who are we to argue with Saturn? You walk out of the courtroom now, your chart still clutched in your hand. It's a strange feeling knowing that once upon a time, the stars might have defended you, accused you, or suggested a softer sentence if Venus was feeling maternal. And as you glance up at the night sky, you can't help but wonder if that glowing constellation overhead is saying, "You're innocent," or just asking, "Did you try turning it off and on again?" Either way, you take a deep breath, thank Mars for his leniency, and go home, free for now, at least until Mercury has another opinion. You're sitting cross-legged on a wooden floor, trying very hard not to sneeze as someone lights yet another stick of lavender incense. Around you, a circle of elaborately dressed nobles are nodding along solemnly, while a man in a silk robe draws something that looks like a spider web, having an existential crisis. He turns to you and declares, "You were probably a donkey in a past life." Saturn confirms it. You nod, because in the mystical realm of karmic astrology, that's not an insult. That's just Tuesday. Unlike other branches of astrology that focus on what's happening now, karmic astrology concerns itself with everything you did before you were born, including but not limited to dying tragically, falling in love with a medieval librarian, failing to return a sacred scroll, or spending an entire past life as someone who always talked during theater performances. The core idea: your soul has lived many lives, and the stars have been keeping score. Historians still argue over when karmic astrology became a formal system, but you can trace elements of it back to ancient India, where Jyotisha or Vedic astrology interwove cosmic influence with reincarnation. Your current joys and disasters, cosmic consequences of your past decisions, including whether you were nice to goats. The system revolves around the nodes of the moon, Rahu and Ketu. These aren't planets, but points where the moon's orbit crosses the sun's path. To astrologers, they're cosmic hinges, entry and exit points for the soul. Rahu represents your karmic cravings, things you chase without knowing why. Ketu is your past life baggage, skills, fears, and occasional unfinished business involving soup. You glance down at the chart drawn for you. Rahu is in your second house, material comfort. Ketu is in the eighth, mystery and transformation. The astrologer strokes his beard. You were once very rich, he says, and also possibly on fire. In karmic astrology, Certain planetary placements suggest specific lessons you're here to learn. A harsh Saturn might mean you shirked responsibility in a past life and now have to learn discipline, possibly through taxes. A strong Venus could mean you once devoted your life to beauty and now have to learn how to do your own laundry. It's strangely comforting. You didn't fail to finish college because of procrastination. It was because your soul needed to learn humility. And you didn't keep dating people who collect taxidermy raccoons for no reason. It was karmic repetition. Totally not your fault. You shift on the floor as the astrologer moves on to retrograde planets. These are planets that appear to move backward in the sky. In karmic astrology, they're like cosmic red flags. A retrograde Mars? Trouble asserting yourself. Retrograde Mercury? Communication issues. Retrograde Pluto? Probably something weird with volcanoes. People have used karmic astrology to explain everything from fear of water to inexplicable talent for spoons. One noblewoman in 17th century Venice claimed her incredible embroidery skills came from a life as a Roman tapestry weaver. Her chart backed it up. She was also terrified of ducks, which no one could explain, but they blamed Neptune. Modern karmic astrology sometimes includes references to specific past lives. One book even includes charts that suggest whether you were a monk, a sailor, a tragic poet, or a mildly successful cheese merchant. If you feel drawn to certain eras or professions, that's Rahu whispering. Remember when we sold butter in 1320? Good times. You watch now as two nobles compare charts and argue over whether they were rival alchemists in a previous life. The astrologer nods thoughtfully, then suggests they duel with breadsticks. It's all very enlightening. Critics have always questioned karmic astrology's factual basis. There are no birth records from your past life after all. And yet, there's something soothing about believing that your weirdness has roots, that your talents, fears, and repeated mistakes all have context. Even Napoleon got into karmic ideas. His astrologer once told him that his relentless ambition stemmed from unfinished dynastic business. Napoleon nodded sagely, then invaded another country. In the East, karmic principles were used to guide monks' reincarnations. In Tibet, high lamas were believed to be reborn in specific locations, predicted in part by stars and dreams. A child who recognized certain objects was assumed to be a reincarnated teacher. Bonus points if they also guessed their moon sign correctly. And karmic astrology wasn't just for humans. One court astrologer in Bengal once claimed a parrot was the reincarnation of a disgraced poet. The parrot was fond of wine and rude couplets, so no one questioned it. You lie back now, gazing at the ceiling. The incense has dulled, the chatter has softened, and the candlelight flickers gently across silk hangings and dusty scrolls. You feel a strange comfort knowing that your quirks aren't just random, they're echoes of choices made long ago. Perhaps that fear of banjos isn't irrational. Maybe you were once chased by a lute playing tax collector. Or maybe you just don't like strings. Either way, the stars remember. They remember everything. And while you can't change the past, you can choose to learn from it, or at least decorate your future with its most charming leftovers. So thank Saturn for the lesson. Apologize to Rahu for doubting his influence. And maybe, just maybe, let Ketu take the wheel for a while. You're wrapped in a woolen blanket, sitting beneath a creaky observatory dome that smells faintly of ink, wet stone, and the desperate dreams of unpaid scholars. Somewhere behind you, someone coughs, and someone else mutters something about Venus being very uncooperative tonight. You, meanwhile, are watching a man with 7 pins stuck in his hair attempt to measure human character through planetary placement. Welcome to the deeply entertaining and occasionally suspicious science of astrological personality typing. Because long before BuzzFeed quizzes and Myers Briggs charts, people were already asking the stars the big questions. Why do I cry during thunderstorms? Is it normal to hoard beans? Does Jupiter like me? Astrologers, never ones to ignore a good branding opportunity, responded with entire systems devoted to mapping your soul via sun signs, moon signs, and rising signs, which, when combined properly, can explain literally everything you've ever done, including why you overwater your plants and distrust people named Greg. You shift in your seat as the astrologer approaches with a scroll labeled Your True Nature. He smiles, then reads dramatically, You are a Capricorn sun, Scorpio moon, with a Pisces rising, which means you work too hard, feel too much, and cry about it in your bathrobe. Nailed it. The system we now think of as the 12 sign zodiac has roots stretching from Babylon to Greece to Rome, where thinkers like Ptolemy categorized personalities according to star positions at birth. Each sign was said to govern certain traits: Aries, bold; Taurus, stubborn; Gemini, talkative; Cancer, emotional; Leo, dramatic; Virgo, anxious; Libra, indecisive; Scorpio, intense; Sagittarius, restless; Capricorn, serious; Aquarius, weird; Pisces, even weirder. Historians still debate whether the original intent was to label people or simply observe patterns, but by the Renaissance, entire books were written that declared, quite confidently, that Scorpios made better soldiers and Libras should avoid archery. No data provided, just vibes. You flip through one such book now. It contains helpful guidance. A man born under Leo shall lead well but eat poorly. A woman of Cancer will charm frogs and lose umbrellas. All Geminis must beware of cheese on Thursdays. Some astrologers went further, assigning body parts to each sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces, which governed the feet. One medical astrologer diagnosed a limp as Piscean trauma and a headache as Martian rebellion. Did it help? Sometimes. Did it get weird? Always. By the 18th century, natal charts, maps of planetary positions at your exact birth, became fashionable among Europe's nobility. Kings, queens, poets, and pickpockets alike wanted to know what kind of cosmic chaos they were born under. Some paid well for flattering results, others demanded rewrites. One duchess insisted she was born under Venus, with Jupiter rising, which sounded sexy and regal. Her astrologer quietly changed her chart after realizing it was actually Mercury and Uranus. She never forgave him. Astrological personality typing expanded into elements: fire, earth, air, water, and modalities: cardinal, fixed, mutable, adding new layers of complexity and confusion. You weren't just a Sagittarius, you were a mutable fire sign with a Leo moon in the fourth house, which made you spontaneous, flammable, and prone to redecorating your mother's house during full moons. You wander into the observatory's back room now, where star charts cover the walls like constellations made of coffee stains. A group of students is arguing whether introversion is caused by a Virgo moon or childhood trauma. The answer, of course, is both. It's around this time you realize how popular astrological personality typing has become, not just among the elite, but among regular folks. Bakers, sailors, seamstresses, and cheesemongers would consult astrologers for life guidance: when to change jobs, who to marry, and whether their goat was secretly plotting against them. In some villages, people avoided hiring Capricorns because of a rumor that they never blink. In others, children born under Sagittarius, were believed to wander off, so their cradles were nailed down. This was not effective. And then, of course, there were compatibility charts. Entire businesses revolved around telling people which signs should and should not date, marry, or share a soup ladle. Aries and Gemini, explosive fun. Taurus and Aquarius, only if they never speak. Virgo and Pisces, the cosmic equivalent of a cat marrying a mop. It was part science, part storytelling, and entirely addictive. You remember a story of two blacksmiths who fell in love after discovering their charts were perfectly aligned. They eloped. Their forge burned down 2 weeks later. Was it fate? Mars? Poor fire safety? No one knows. You settle down beside a telescope now, sipping lukewarm tea and considering your own chart. Maybe your fear of clowns is because Neptune squared your moon. Maybe your talent for folding laundry is a gift from Saturn. Or maybe you're just a person who finds comfort in stories. And that's the real charm of astrological personality typing. It doesn't always make sense, but it gives people a language, a way to describe themselves, each other, and the peculiar joy of being slightly predictable under an unpredictable sky. So, whether you're a triple Gemini or a Virgo with commitment issues and a suspicious cat, the stars have something to say. And tonight, under their silent watch, you're just trying to figure out whether your sun sign explains your ongoing feud with soup lids. Spoiler, it does. You're curled up on a straw mattress in a one-room stone cottage, surrounded by candlelight and the sound of distant owls, those smug, judgmental birds that probably know your moon sign. Your fingers trace the rim of a chipped teacup as an elderly astrologer beside you murmurs softly from a leather-bound book titled The Grand Influences of the Universe and Also Love. Tonight, she's talking about the great conjunctions, those rare celestial meetups that sent entire towns into fits of prophecy, panic, or spontaneous poetry. Throughout history, when two or more bright planets like Jupiter and Saturn appeared close together in the night sky, people lost their collective minds. And who can blame them? These weren't everyday stargazing events. They were slow, majestic, deeply ominous reminders that something very large was happening far above your soup pot. You lean closer as the astrologer points to a scribbled diagram. This, she whispers, is where they met in Pisces, which means emotional revolution, or possibly a lot of crying at weddings. Historians still argue about whether these conjunctions actually inspired major events or were simply coincidental. But in 1226, when Jupiter and Saturn aligned, monks wrote of strange weather, crop failures, and an unusual number of goats behaving with intent. One even declared it a sign that the Antichrist had purchased new sandals. In 1583, a great conjunction sparked pamphlets across Europe warning of the end of the world, the return of Caesar, or worst of all, an unexpected tax. Spoiler: none of those happened unless you count Caesar's salad making a comeback centuries later. You glance out the window now. The stars are bright, the sky crisp. The air hums with that particular stillness that only arrives when the cosmos feels close enough to whisper. People saw these conjunctions as cosmic resets, windows when fate could be rewritten, for better or worse. Kings consulted astrologers. Merchants held back shipments. One baker in Florence delayed opening his bakery for 3 days out of respect for Jupiter. The bread was awful, but the gesture was poetic. Some believe these alignments marked the birth of prophets, the fall of empires, or the subtle rearrangement of destiny's furniture. It wasn't always about doom. It was about possibility. The world tilting slightly on its axis, inviting you to notice. You close your eyes and remember the feeling, watching two planets drift together like old friends meeting after centuries apart. Silent, slow, unapologetically majestic. It makes you feel small, yes, but also woven into something bigger. Astrologers through the ages were both thrilled and terrified by these events. Some made their reputations predicting what would follow. Others disappeared quietly when their massive squirrel uprising forecast didn't materialize. And yet, the appeal never faded. Even today, thousands gather to watch these planetary dances. People light candles, make wishes, or simply stare in quiet wonder. One man in Arizona built an entire observatory just to see Saturn kiss Jupiter. He cried when it happened. He also burned the toast. Again, poetic. You turn to the astrologer now. She's fallen asleep mid sentence, face resting gently on her book. Her breath is soft, her chart ink smudged. The candle flickers once, then settles. And in this moment, quiet, tender, filled with cosmic crumbs, you understand why people believed for so long. Not because the stars controlled us, but because they made the world feel like it had a pattern, a rhythm, a message written in light saying, "You matter," even if only as a tiny dot on an ancient chart. So you breathe in, hold the warm cup in your hands, and let your eyelids drift down. The stars keep spinning, the planets keep dancing, and you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And now, as the last constellation fades from your mind's eye, the world begins to soften. The rustle of parchment quiets. The scent of wax and herbs lingers just faintly. Somewhere far off, a bell chimes, not urgent, not demanding, just a gentle note in the background of the universe's lullaby. The astrologers, the kings, the travelers, they all return to the mist of memory. Their charts fold, their robes settle, their candles flicker out. You're no longer in the dusty tower, nor the tent in the square, nor the echoing halls of celestial courts. You're simply here, warm, weightless, wrapped in the hush of a night that has nothing left to ask of you. There's no need to check the stars, no planets to track, no houses to align, just your breath, slow and steady, rising like moonlight over still water. Maybe you were a donkey in a past life. Maybe you were an emperor with poor taste in omens. Maybe you were just someone who likes staring up and wondering long before Google Sky. Whatever you were, whatever you are, you're safe now. Let the questions float away. Let Mars worry about itself. Let Venus take her beauty nap. You have done enough for one night. The chart is blank. The sky is clear. And the only prediction now, you will drift gently into dreams.